Hello everyone and welcome to the second bread loaf, a long overdue episode. In this one we're going to be tackling altitude, matching your enemy's altitude or offsetting it, dealing with terrain and waves, that kind of stuff. Very short disclaimer, I'm not going to be dealing with anything that rolls to turn, namely planes, because that adds a layer of complexity that just makes everything so much more of a headache. Let's see if future me in editing can remember to plug in the screenshot of my plain breadboard, but yeah. Anyway, we're gonna get started right away with the humble altitude PID because everything hinges on that. So I've already gone ahead and placed the main frame with the breadboard. First things you're gonna need are obviously an altitude readout, a constant, a PID, and a propulsion output for hover up and down, which is the default. I'm going to go ahead and already connect the PID to the propulsion component because if you're, well, somewhat familiar with plain, not plain, but breadboard PIDs, you'll know that sometimes you have to invert the output. This is not the case for altitude. And then we're going to set up the altitude readout on the top pin and the constant on the second one. The constant right now is your target altitude, so I'm going to put it higher. I'm going to say 15. And for this component, the altitude component, you have a drop-down menu, which is very important depending on the type of vehicle you're using. You're going to be looking to use different altitude readouts. For example, the average sea level might be more important to you in a submarine, for example, than say terrain and average sea level or something like that, or terrain and waves. Now, that said, submarines do need to pay attention to the seafloor, so we're going to be tackling that later. But basically, this is it. This is the simplest form of altitude management with a breadboard. It's just a PID, simple PID. If you don't know how to tweak PIDs, again, I do have a tutorial on that. It's less than 10 minutes. So look it up if you're confused by that. Anyway, of course, this always, as always, hinges on the fact that you set up your propulsion correctly, but this is the gist of it. This is a working altitude PID. So we're going to move on to something a little bit more complex. Next, we have using pitch to control your altitude. Now, this is perfect for a plane, especially if you don't use roll to turn, and anything that goes forward all the time, it's going to be really reliable. Now, if your vehicle can also go backwards, things can be a little bit tricky, right? You can check to see if your vehicle is trying to go backwards or forwards, but at the time of making this video, you can't be sure that it's actually doing it. So if for whatever reason it's not doing it, and for example you're pointing down, trying to go backwards to climb, well, if you're still going forwards because, I don't know, your forward propulsion is damaged or whatever, it's going to end up in sadness, right? It's going to be quite sketchy. So preferably only on vehicles that go forward. You can make it work for vehicles that go in both directions. Just a little bit more difficult. Anyway, let's start explaining things, one component at a time. Right now, I've got a clamp selected. This is very important for using pitch to control altitude because, generally speaking, you'll never want to pitch harder than 90 degrees in either direction. So what the clamp does is it prevents sending in a value that's below or above a certain number. So for example, we could do minus 90 and plus 90. So now it can never go below minus 90 or above 90. And that makes sure that no matter the math we put into this math evaluator, which I'm going to get to in a second, no matter what we do there, we can never exceed 90 degrees. Now, of course, you can put lower values than that. Probably you'll want to use lower values than that because 90 is quite a bit extreme. It's straight up or straight down. Now we're going to put that clamp and connect it over there. And we're going to work our way backwards. Now we have this math evaluator, which is currently empty. There's a lot of options there. Before that, we have the altitude readout, which we're going to connect there. And we have a constant. It doesn't have to be a constant, but we're going to use that for the sake of example right now. And we're also going to connect that there. And we're going to connect the math evaluator here. Then we have an orientation input for pitch for the PID to know the current pitch of your vehicle. So we're going to connect that. And we're going to connect the PID to a multiplier, which we're going to set to -1. As I was saying earlier, pitch PIDs and roll PIDs are notable for needing to be inverted, whereas the altitude PID does not. And then we're putting that into a propulsion output set to pitch, naturally. Now, what can we do with this math evaluator? Well, you could simply do the difference between your current altitude and your desired altitude. And immediately we see that my hover tank in the background is going to try to pitch to match 30 meters in altitude, and it's currently at 19, so it's trying to pitch up. Negative values are pointing up. Basically, think of it as if you are pulling on the back of the vehicle. If you're pulling down on the back of the vehicle, the front will go up, and vice versa. So there we go. We can make this a bit more complicated by putting this in parentheses, and you can either multiply it, let's say by 2 to make it more sensitive, or divide it, I don't know, by 90, which would be pretty significant depending on the altitudes your vehicle you want your vehicle to operate at. But you could do that. You could also replace this math evaluator with a PID, and it would calculate an angle, and you could use, for example, integral, which could make the angle sharper and sharper if somehow you're having trouble to reach your desired altitude over time. And oh my god, my throat, excuse me for a second. Okay. So you could use a PID here. Another thing you could do, for example, if you don't want your vehicle to use pitch to control altitude all of the time, you could say, well, if my current altitude is less than, let's say, 5, or if my current altitude is greater than, say, 100, then, and in this case it would be a bit awkward, right? Because we need to figure out which of the two it is. So let's actually move this condition somewhere. Well, we're going to keep the condition this way, but we're going to double check for it. So you can embed conditions, so be careful. This is going to get a little bit complicated very quickly. So we're checking if we are either below 5 or above 100. So far, so good. Then what? Well, again, if we are below 5, then let's say I want to have 15 degrees of pitch downwards. Downwards, that doesn't work. That would send us further down. Minus 15. That will send us up. If not, then we know we are above 100. Otherwise, this is just not true. So we're going to send, or say, pitch down by 15. And if neither of those are true, then 0. So in this case, we wouldn't be using pitch to control altitude unless we are either below 5 meters or above 100 meters. And if we are below 5 meters, we would pitch up by 15 degrees. And if we are above 100 meters, we would pitch down by 15 degrees. As soon as we are within 5 to 100 meters of altitude, we would level out. And that's how this works. Again, you could use a PID. There's no limit to the math you can use there. The clamp is extremely vital. Make sure you set limits that will, well, anything below or above 90 will be essentially a fail-safe that even if you fudge the math, you're going to be fine. But it's also a way to make extra sure you're never pitching up or down more than you want. Moving on. Next if you want to match your enemy's altitude or, base your own altitude off of your enemies, we're just going to use a regular altitude PID, but we're going to replace our constant with a primary target info. Now, if you don't have that, it's because you're just using a regular breadboard instead of an AI breadboard, so make sure you're using the AI breadboard and you can use the primary target info. Now, if you mouse over each pin, it'll tell you what's going to be outputted. And in this case, we're going to want target altitude. So we're simply going to feed the target altitude into the PID like so. And technically, we are done. Now, if you do this and you put this, for example, on a plane or whatever, and you're targeting a submarine, it will try to send you into the water. So one of the things you're almost guaranteed to want is a clamp, again, to limit the altitude at which you would be going, trying to match your enemy. So for example, in this case, we'd say between 100 and 400. If it's any less than that or any more than that, we're not going there. That's it, done and done. And that would work. If you want to offset your altitude compared to your enemies, basically, I don't know, you want to be above them at all times, you can do the same thing. Keep the clamp, feed this back into the clamp again to make sure you're staying within the altitude bracket that you want to be at, and let's say plus 100. And now, if your enemy is at 0, you're going to try to be at 100. If they're at 100 themselves, you're going to try to be at 200 meters altitude, and so on. And that makes sure you're going to be above, for most part, except if your enemy is above your maximum altitude. But yeah, there's no limit to the math you can do there. Very simple, very effective. And finally, I'm going to explain how to deal with different altitudes. For example, my hover tanks don't want to smack into land. They don't want to go under the waves. And with a submarine, for example, you'd also want to stay under the waves, but also above the land. You don't want to smack into the seafloor, obviously. And so this is how I do it on my hover tanks. Now, hopefully, this is a bit complicated, but I'm going to break it down into pieces and you should be able to reassemble it in the way you want for your own vehicle. Now, I'm not going to show you how I determine the altitude that I want. You can see that there's a number coming up here, which is 15, and feeding into my PID and then into the up thrust. Now, this would be a bit anxiety inducing, and I'm going to explain it in another video as well. But for the sake of this part is just a standard altitude PID. Now the magic happens on this side, and it is basically a way for me to pick which altitude I want to refer to. So the first thing you want, obviously, is going to be different altitude modules to compare the different things you want to watch out for. So generally speaking, I'm going to watch for average sea level because this is constant. And this is really useful for me, for my hover tanks, because, well, if I always refer to the waves are going to change all the time, and it's going to be a bit difficult to avoid the waves ahead of time. Then there's also altitude above terrain. And so if you look, I'll invite you to look over here in the top right, because looking at the equation down here is going to be a bit annoying and distracting with the numbers changing. Awkward transition because I kind of got lost explaining this equation. I'm going to simplify it as much as possible. So basically, there's two equations in here, right? Because there's a comma. And that first equation is going to control what is going to the first pin and essentially what altitude I'm referring to for my altitude PID. And whatever is after the comma is going to be the second pin. And this is a placeholder, essentially. And it's allowing me to keep a value in memory. That's what the output function does, essentially. Output, and then parenthesis, and a number in there, is going to refer to the last value that was on that pin. So if I have output 1, right now, output 1 would be 15. Output 2 is minus 1.02. And if I had the third pin, it would be whatever value is there. Now, on its own, it's not very helpful because it's just going to repeat the last value. So if you just have output 1, for example, as an equation, well, is just going to be output 1. So whatever value happens to be output 1, it's going to repeat that endlessly. But if you use an if statement, in this case, I'm checking the difference between the average sea level and the wave level. And I'm checking if my current output is greater than that difference or not. If it is greater, then I'm recording or outputting that difference. And if it's not, I'm outputting the last value. So basically, this number can only go up, right? The higher the waves, the higher the value will go. And if I go over a smaller wave, it's not going to matter because the condition is not going to trigger and it's just going to output the same thing over and over until there's a value, there's a greater difference between a thing. The multiplication by D is just basically a reset. So every time I spawn the vehicle in, it's going to reset to 0, just in case. If you're going to use output equations, you should probably have a reset. Anyway, so what this equation does is, in the second part, I'm calculating the greatest difference between the average sea level and the waves, which is essentially the tallest waves I've gone above. And in the second one, I'm either using the terrain. If I'm closest to the terrain, I'm going to use the terrain as a reference point for my altitude. And if not, I'm going to use the average sea level plus the difference between the highest wave and the average sea level. And that way I can keep my altitude above the waves. Now, the only flaw with this is that if I haven't been above a wave, then I don't know what the difference in altitude is, and there's still a chance I'm going to smack into it. Sadly, it's just the way it is. There's not really any other way to do this. You can't really tell how tall the waves are until you go above them. So unfortunate, but at least I've got a way to get out of the water, and then because I've recorded that altitude, I'm not going to smack into it a second time. And that's the gist of it, right? I'm just calculating the difference between the average sea level and the wave level, and I'm comparing that with my saved value, essentially the highest recorded value. And if it's higher, then I record the higher value. If it's not, I don't care. I keep the same value. Put that into the PID, and it works like a charm. Anyway, hopefully this last part wasn't too complicated. It's pretty advanced, but whatever. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.